Charleston County, South Carolina. September 1847. When the servants finally broke down the door to the master bedroom of Bellwood Manor, they found Colonel Augustus Van Dorn seated at his dining table, fork in hand, staring at an elaborate silver platter before him. He had been dead for 3 days. The coroner's report, sealed by order of the state legislature and locked away for 97 years, described what was on that platter in clinical detail that still makes archivists refuse to discuss it. But the most disturbing detail wasn't what killed the colonel. It was the elderly house servant found kneeling beside him, her hands folded in prayer, repeating the same words over and over. "I served him faithful. 30 years faithful." Just like she asked. What the authorities discovered in the manor's hidden rooms would force them to rewrite everything they thought they knew about one of Charleston's most respected families. Before we continue with the story of Dinah Colebrook and the Van Dorn family tragedy, we need you to be part of this community. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, buried by history itself, deserve to be told. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our truth seekers are gathering. What happened at Bellwood Manor that September didn't begin with a death. It began 3 decades earlier, with a promise made in blood and witnessed by no one. Charleston, in 1817, represented everything the young American Republic aspired to become. The city's white-columned mansions rose like monuments to prosperity along the Ashley River, their manicured gardens stretching toward cypress swamps that marked the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The Van Dorn family occupied the highest tier of this carefully constructed society, their wealth built on rice plantations that stretched across 3 counties and the labor of 200 enslaved people whose names appeared only in ledgers and bills of sale. Augustus Van Dorn married Constance Pritchard in the spring of 1816, uniting 2 of Charleston's founding families in a ceremony that lasted 3 days and cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. Constance brought a dowry of land and reputation. Augustus brought ambition wrapped in gentleman's clothes. He was 32, she was 19, and their union was considered perfect by every measure that society recognized. The only person who seemed to harbor doubts was a house servant named Dinah Colebrook, purchased by the Van Dorn family when she was just 8 years old. By 1817, Dinah had served the household for 15 years, working her way from kitchen duty to the position of Constance's personal maid. She was known throughout Charleston's servant network as uncommonly intelligent, literate despite laws forbidding it, and fiercely devoted to her young mistress. Other servants whispered that Constance had taught Dinah to read using her own childhood primers, a dangerous gift that could result in severe punishment if discovered. Bellwood Manor stood 3 miles from Charleston proper, far enough to maintain privacy but close enough to project power. The main house featured 22 rooms, including a library that held over 3,000 volumes, a music room with a pianoforte imported from Vienna, and a dining room designed to seat 30 guests beneath crystal chandeliers shipped from France. Separate buildings housed the kitchen, laundry, and servant quarters, a small city dedicated to maintaining the illusion of effortless gentility. The manor's location offered certain advantages beyond aesthetics. The property bordered the Ashley River on one side and thick maritime forest on the other. The nearest neighbor lived a half-mile away, separated by dense vegetation that made the Van Dorn estate feel isolated despite its proximity to the city. This isolation, which Augustus praised as providing peaceful contemplation, would later prove significant in ways no one anticipated. Dinah occupied a small room attached to the main house, a privilege granted to upper servants. Her quarters consisted of a narrow bed, a wooden chest for her few possessions, and a window that overlooked the herb garden. Other servants occupied the quarters building, but Dinah's position required her to remain close to her mistress at all times, day and night. This arrangement struck some as unusual, Personal maids typically returned to the quarters after evening duties, but Constance insisted, claiming she suffered from nightmares and needed Dinah nearby for comfort. The truth, which Dinah would later reveal in testimony that was immediately suppressed, was darker than anyone suspected. Augustus Van Dorn presented a careful face to Charleston society. He attended Christ Church every Sunday, served on the boards of charitable organizations, and spoke eloquently about his responsibilities as a Christian slaveholder to civilize and convert those under his care. His neighbors considered him a model plantation owner, progressive in his methods and generous with his profits. Several ministers praised his moral character from their pulpits. Behind the closed doors of Bellwood Manor, a different man emerged. Constance's nightmares weren't dreams. They were Augustus's nightly visits to her bedroom, visits that left bruises hidden beneath long sleeves and high collars. The sounds that sometimes echoed through the manor's halls after midnight, officially explained as settling floorboards or wind through the chimneys, told a different story to those who understood what they were hearing. Dinah heard everything. Her room shared a wall with Constance's bedroom, separated by plaster thin enough to transmit whispers. She heard her mistress's muffled cries, Augustus's slurred demands, the crash of furniture, and the long silences that followed. She heard Constance weeping into her pillow when Augustus finally left, heard her mistress pray for death or deliverance, or simply the strength to survive another day. And Dinah could do nothing. Speaking out meant certain death, probably preceded by torture meant to serve as an example to other servants. Even hinting at the truth to other household staff would risk Constance's life. Augustus's brutality grew worse when he suspected his wife of disloyalty, and confiding in servants would constitute betrayal in his eyes. So Dinah learned to move silently through the manor like a ghost, anticipating her mistress's needs before they were spoken, maintaining the fiction of a harmonious household, while watching Constance fade like a flower cut from its stem. She learned which herbs helped Constance sleep through the pain, which poultices reduced swelling, which teas eased the bleeding that sometimes lasted for days. She learned to lie convincingly to the physician Augustus summoned whenever injuries couldn't be hidden, reciting the stories about falls, clumsy accidents, and her mistress's supposed delicate constitution. Charleston society saw only what it wanted to see: a distinguished gentleman and his refined wife. Living proof that Southern civilization represented humanity's highest achievement. They saw Constance's increasing fragility as feminine delicacy, her withdrawal from social engagements as appropriate modesty, her silences as proper submission to her husband's wisdom. They didn't see Dinah carefully washing blood from expensive linens at midnight, or Constance staring for hours at the river, or Augustus's smile growing wider as his wife grew quieter. They didn't notice how Dinah's expression hardened over the years, or how her hands clenched into fists when Augustus passed, or how something behind her eyes began to change from fear to calculation. By 1820, Constance had suffered 3 miscarriages, each one blamed on her weak constitution rather than the beatings that preceded them by days. The physician, Dr. Clement Fairchild, noted in his private journal, discovered only after his death in 1853, that he harbored suspicions about Mrs. Van Dorn's injuries, but feared social and professional destruction if he voiced them. He wrote, "What power have I against a man of Colonel Van Dorn's? Standing to accuse him would destroy me, and help her not at all. Better to tend her injuries and pray for her deliverance, though I fear that deliverance may come only through death." Charleston's social calendar continued its relentless cycle. The Van Dorns hosted parties where guests praised Constance's grace while she moved among them like a beautiful ghost. Augustus held court in his library, discussing philosophy and religion with other planters while sipping imported brandy. Dinah served tea with steady hands and downcast eyes, her mind cataloguing every detail, every cruelty, every injustice that the fine ladies and gentlemen chose not to see. Something was building behind Dinah's careful servant's mask. Something patient and precise and utterly devoted to the young woman who had shown her kindness in a world designed to crush them both. The other servants began to notice subtle changes. How Dinah would pause sometimes when handling Augustus's food, staring at his plate with an expression that made them uncomfortable. How she spent hours in the herb garden, cultivating plants that no one requested. How she asked strange questions about poisons during casual conversations, then claimed she was concerned about rats in the kitchen. No one reported these observations to Augustus. The unspoken code among servants protected their own, and everyone loved Constance even as they feared her husband. If Dinah was planning something, most of them hoped she would succeed. But Dinah wasn't planning anything yet. She was waiting for the right moment, the right method, the right circumstances that would allow her to act without immediate discovery. She had learned patience through years of silent suffering, and she would need every ounce of that patience for what was slowly taking shape in her mind. The summer of 1820 brought unusual heat to the Low Country. Temperatures soared above 100 degrees for weeks, turning the rice fields into shimmering mirrors and making even simple movement exhausting. The heat frayed tempers throughout Charleston, leading to duels, domestic violence, and several deaths attributed to heat stroke. At Bellwood Manor, the oppressive weather seemed to amplify everything, including Augustus's cruelty and Dinah's growing desperation. On August 17, 1820, Constance Van Dorn tried to kill herself. Dinah found her mistress in the bathing room just after dawn, lying in a copper tub filled with water turned pink with blood. Constance had used a straight razor to open both wrists, the cuts deep and purposeful, the kind that comes from genuine determination rather than a cry for help. Dinah moved with swift efficiency born from years of crisis management. She pulled Constance from the tub, wrapped her wrists with strips torn from her own shift, and applied pressure while screaming for help. The other servants came running, and together they managed to slow the bleeding enough for Dr. Fairchild to arrive and complete the work. Augustus was away in Colombia on political business, a fortunate circumstance that gave them time to clean up the worst evidence. Dr. Fairchild, his hands still shaking as he sutured Constance's wrists, looked at Dinah with eyes that held both pity and terrible understanding. Why, he asked quietly, though they both knew he wasn't asking why Constance had tried to die. "She can't take no more," Dinah replied, her voice steady despite the blood soaking her clothes. "She'd been asking the Lord to take her. I guess she decided to help him along." The physician nodded slowly, then did something that shocked everyone present. He turned to the assembled servants and spoke in a low, urgent voice. Mrs. Van Dorn fell while bathing. The tub overturned, and she struck her wrists against broken porcelain. "That is what happened. That is what you will say if anyone asks. Do you understand?" They understood. They understood that Dr. Fairchild was protecting Constance from the legal and social consequences of attempted suicide, which would result in her commitment to an asylum and complete loss of what little autonomy she possessed. They understood that he was also protecting them from Augustus's rage if the truth emerged. And they understood, though no one spoke it aloud, that the doctor knew exactly why Constance had wanted to die. Constance survived, though survived seemed too generous a word for her condition afterward. She lay in her bed for 3 weeks, staring at the ceiling with empty eyes, speaking to no one, eating only when Dinah forced small spoonfuls of broth between her lips. The scars on her wrists were angry red marks that would fade to white but never disappear, permanent reminders of her desperation. Augustus returned from Colombia, full of energy and political gossip, barely noticing his wife's deteriorated state. When he finally acknowledged her condition, he accepted Dr. Fairchild's lie about the bathing accident with barely a question. Either he believed it, or he simply didn't care enough to investigate further. He complained about the expense of the physician's extended care, grumbled about Constance's weakness, and resumed his normal routines as if nothing had happened. But something had changed in Dinah. As she sat beside Constance's bed during those long recovery days, reading aloud from books of poetry or simply holding her mistress's hand, a cold clarity settled over her like frost. Her mistress had tried to escape through death and failed. The physician knew the truth but was powerless to act. Charleston society would continue pretending everything was fine. The law offered no protection. God, if he existed, appeared uninterested in intervening, which meant that if Constance was to find any relief, Dinah would have to provide it herself. The thought crystallized slowly, taking shape over weeks of careful consideration. Murder. The word felt simultaneously foreign and inevitable in Dinah's mind. She turned it over carefully, examining it from every angle, testing its weight. She had never killed anything larger than a chicken, and even that made her queasy. But she had also watched her beloved mistress bleed out in a bathtub, had seen the desperation in Constance's eyes, had heard her pray for death night after night. The practical obstacles seemed insurmountable. Augustus was a large, strong man in excellent health. He carried pistols when he traveled and kept rifles in his study. His position in society meant his death would trigger intense investigation. And if Dinah was caught, her execution would be slow and public, designed to terrorize other enslaved people into absolute submission. But Dinah had advantages too. She was invisible. Servants always were to men like Augustus. She had access to his food, his drink, his private spaces. She was literate and had read extensively from the Van Dorn Library, including medical texts and botanical guides. She knew which plants growing wild in the South Carolina low country could kill, and which could do so while mimicking natural illness. Most importantly, she had time. Augustus was only 36 years old, likely to live for decades more. Decades of torturing Constance, decades of bruises and blood and despair. Unless someone stopped him. Dinah began her education in death with the same methodical care she brought to all her duties. She studied the medical books in Augustus's library during the few hours she had to herself, learning about diseases common to the region: malaria, yellow fever, cholera, typhoid. She memorized symptoms, timelines, mortality rates. She noted which illnesses progressed slowly versus quickly, which prompted physicians to order autopsies, which were so common that they rarely warranted deep investigation. She expanded her herb garden, claiming she was developing remedies for common ailments. The other servants appreciated her efforts. Her poultices genuinely helped with minor injuries and illnesses. Augustus never noticed the additional plants. Why would he? The garden was servants' business, beneath his attention. Among the medicinal herbs, Dinah cultivated other species. White snake root, which caused trembles and could be mistaken for various wasting diseases. Foxglove, whose digitalis affected the heart in ways that mimicked natural cardiac failure. Oleander, beautiful and deadly, growing wild throughout the Low Country. She learned their properties, their dosages, their effects, but she didn't act. Not yet, because rushing would mean discovery, and discovery would mean failure, and failure would leave Constance alone with Augustus forever. Constance slowly recovered from her suicide attempt, though she remained fragile in ways that went beyond the physical. She barely spoke, except to Dinah, and even then only in whispers. She moved through the manor like a ghost haunting the scene of its own death. At night, when Augustus came to her room, Dinah heard her mistress's prayers. "Please, God, please let it end. Please let me go." Those prayers became Dinah's purpose. If God wouldn't answer, she would answer in his place. She would become the instrument of Constance's deliverance, whatever the cost to her own soul. The years between 1820 and 1847 passed with terrible slowness at Bellwood Manor, each day a repetition of the last in a cycle of genteel horror that Charleston society continued to ignore. But beneath the surface of those seemingly unchanging years, two parallel transformations were taking place. Constance Van Dorn's slow dissolution and Dinah Colebrook's careful preparation for murder. Constance aged rapidly after her failed suicide attempt. The young woman who had married Augustus at 19 became unrecognizable by 30. Her hair turned gray at the temples, then spread until she looked 20 years older than her actual age. Her skin took on a papery quality, stretched too tight over bones that became more prominent as she ate less and less. The monthly beatings continued with mechanical regularity, though Augustus seemed almost bored by them now, administering violence with the same casual attention he gave to business correspondence. She stopped leaving the manor entirely after 1825, claiming illness. Charleston society clucked sympathetically about her delicate constitution, while privately whispering about her strangeness, her reclusiveness, her failure to produce an heir. Some suggested Augustus should set her aside and remarry. Surely God wouldn't object to a man seeking a healthy wife who could bear children. Augustus deflected these suggestions with public displays of devotion that made Dinah's stomach turn. Dr. Fairchild visited regularly, prescribing tonics and rest, his eyes always avoiding Dinah's because they both knew the truth he refused to speak. He noted Constance's declining health in his journal with clinical detachment that barely concealed his guilt. Mrs. V continues her deterioration. No physical cause can be determined. I suspect the root is spiritual or mental, but such diagnoses remain beyond my expertise. I have failed her completely. But while Constance faded, Dinah grew stronger. Not physically, the years of labor and stress were taking their toll on her body as well, but in purpose and knowledge. She transformed herself into a scholar of death, studying every method of killing that might escape detection in 1840s South Carolina. She learned that arsenic, the murder weapon of choice in popular novels, left distinctive traces in the body and prompted immediate suspicion. She learned that most plant poisons produce symptoms too dramatic and unusual to pass as natural illness. She learned that quick deaths triggered investigations while slow ones often went unquestioned, especially if the victim was known to be in poor health. She also learned about Augustus in ways that he never suspected. She observed his habits, his preferences, his routines. She knew that he drank exactly 3 glasses of brandy every evening in his study, that he insisted his meat be cooked rare, that he had developed a taste for oysters brought fresh from Charleston markets every Friday. She knew that he suffered from gout, that he refused to acknowledge publicly, that his eyesight was beginning to fail though he wouldn't admit it, that he sometimes experienced chest pains he attributed to indigestion. Most importantly, she learned about the secret room. Bellwood Manor held many secrets in its walls, but this was the deepest. Behind a bookcase in Augustus's study, accessible only through a hidden latch, lay a small chamber, perhaps 10 feet square. Dinah discovered it by accident in 1828 while cleaning, seeing Augustus emerge from what appeared to be solid wall. She waited until he left for Charleston, then found the mechanism and explored the space. What she found there confirmed every terrible suspicion she'd harbored. A chair with leather restraints, chains attached to the wall, instruments whose purposes she didn't want to imagine but understood anyway, and journals, dozens of leather-bound journals, in which Augustus had recorded his activities with disturbing clinical detail. Dinah read them all, every page, every entry, every description of what he'd done to Constance and, in earlier years, to enslaved women whose names appeared only once in his meticulous records before they disappeared from the plantation entirely. The journals revealed a man who had systematically transformed cruelty into a science, documenting his experiments in causing pain with the same careful attention other men brought to agriculture or business. She memorized passages without meaning to, words searing themselves into her brain. Subject shows remarkable resilience. Increased pressure to the ribs until I heard the crack. Her eyes quite beautiful in their terror. The entries went back years, predating his marriage, revealing that Constance wasn't Augustus's first victim, merely his most permanent one. Dinah carefully returned everything to its exact position, locked the room, and spent the next 3 days vomiting whenever she thought about what she'd read. But the discovery crystallized her resolve. Augustus Van Dorn wasn't just a cruel husband. He was a monster wearing a gentleman's mask, and he would continue his tortures until someone stopped him. The question was no longer whether to kill him, but how to kill him in a way that wouldn't be discovered and wouldn't implicate Constance. Because Dinah had realized something crucial: if Augustus died under suspicious circumstances, Constance would be the primary suspect. Wife murders husband. It happened often enough to have established legal precedent. And if Constance were convicted, Dinah would be called as a witness and probably executed as an accomplice. No, Augustus's death had to appear completely natural. It had to emerge from his own body's failure, something that could happen to any man in his 40s who worked too hard and indulged too much. Heart failure, stroke,